Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of the Topology Crash Course. In this episode I will help you understand what subdivision workflow means as well as how it works. I will try to explain everything as simply as possible because it's quite a lot to take in. Now, in order to illustrate the core principle of the subdivision workflow, I will showcase it on a 2D shape. With that being said, the exact same principle applies for 3D objects. I will start this off with a simple square. Now, if you were to subdivide a square, you would get a circle, and here's why. Every shape is defined by boundary points located at each cardinal point. These points represent the furthest boundaries of the shape. And even though the subdivided square becomes a circle, its structural cage remains square. In fact, the structural cage is always square. In 3D, it's obviously a cube instead of a square, but the core principle is the same. So in Photoshop, even though your shape is spherical, like here we have a circle, and you press Ctrl T, the boundary will remain square regardless. And if you distort the square cage, it will inevitably distort the subdivided shape. If you are familiar with the pencil, you already know exactly how this works. The boundary points are used as anchor points for the spline, and the anchor handles are determined by the structural cage. And as you can see, the anchor handles follow the structural cage, and their length is determined by the middle of the intersecting points of the same cage. As you can see, each anchor handle follows the intersection. Now, if we were to draw a spline with a pen tool while following these anchor points, we would get a pretty much perfect circle. Let's try it out. We're gonna take the pen tool, and we're gonna follow these anchors. As you can see, we're getting pretty much a perfect circle. So now that we understand the core principle of subdivision and how it works, let's jump into Cinema 4D and see how it applies in practical cases. Alright, so here we are inside of Cinema 4D and I have a few practical examples to showcase the subdivision workflow. Now, once you have your object, you can access the subdivision modifier with this icon over here. So if you press it, it's going to create a subdivision surface object, and you can simply take your object and drag and drop it inside. Or if you want to be quicker about it, what you can do is select your object, hold Alt, and click on the subdivision icon. This will automatically place your object inside of the subdivision. Alright, so let's see what the subdivision surface does to our simple plane. So when you have your subdivision, you can turn it off with this button over here. Or if you want to toggle it quickly, you can press Q on your keyboard. So once we have the subdivision turned on, we can see two things happen. Firstly, all the corners have been rounded, as you can see, and each square has been subdivided into 16 squares. So now each square became a 4x4 grid. Now let's see how we can control the subdivision behavior. So here, like I said, we have a rounded corner, and that's because it uses these boundary points over here to curve the surface. If we want this to be a sharper corner, we need to bring these boundary points closer. How we can do that? That's pretty simple. We go in Edge mode and select these two edges. Then select the Move tool, like we saw in the previous episode. And we can move the edge closer to the corner here. What this will do is it will create more boundary points closer to the corner. And now you can see the corner is not as rounded as the other ones. This is the main trick we use to sharpen the corner or in general control the subdivision behavior. Now if we want to sharpen all the corners at once, we can select the Loop Cut tool. We saw it in the previous episode. We select it with KL and we do the loop cuts around the whole plane. And now as you can see, all the corners are sharpened. That was pretty simple. Now let's see how we can subdivide a square into a circle. So let's say I want to extrude a circular shape, for example a small button, in the middle of the plane here. What I would do is select the boundary points of the circle I want, just like this. And you can notice these are the same boundary points as we saw earlier. So since I have more polygons around my selection, I'm going to scale these. I'm going to press T and scale these at about 140%. You wouldn't have to do that if you didn't have extra polygons on the sides. So now that we have a shape resembling a circle, we can select the polygons in the middle. We're going to take the Extrude Inner tool. We're going to extrude inner just a bit, like this. Then we're going to extrude out just a bit. Now we're going to go up and do the same small extrude out and inner. Now if we turn on the subdivision surface, we can see that we successfully extruded a circular shape out of the plane. Now you might be wondering, why did these two small extrudes on the sides and the top here? The role of these two small extrudes, this one and this one, is to sharpen the corner. So once I turn on the subdivision, you can see the corner is slightly rounded. And these two loop edges control the amount of roundness we have in our corner, just like we saw with the corners here in the plane. And you can see we have the same thing at the top and at the bottom. Now obviously if you select these loop cuts and take this scale tool and move them further away, the corners will be more rounded, and vice versa. So that was an example on a flat surface. Now let's take a look at how subdivision works on a curved surface. So here once again I have a plane, but this time I bent it at an angle. So now we have something that somewhat looks like a curved surface. But obviously we don't want this hard edge over here, so what we do is we apply the subdivision surface. And as you can see, it becomes a smooth curve. Now this is a pretty simple 2x2 plane, and the reason we want to keep the poly count low is because the more polygons we have, the more it affects the smoothness of our curve. So if I take the plane and select all the polygons, I right click and I subdivide them, now we have more polygons, and I turn back on the subdivision, we can see that the curve is not as smooth anymore. If we go back, as you can see now it's really smooth, and if I subdivide it, it becomes less smooth. And that happens because when we subdivide the surface, we add more points. So these ones over here, and since we add more points closer to the curve, it's going to sharpen our curved surface. So because of that, you need to keep in mind your poly count when working on a curved surface. So for our third example, we have a circular object. As you can see, it's a very low poly cylinder, and if we apply the subdivision surface, it becomes a perfectly smooth cylinder. And this happens because the boundary points, these ones and these ones for example, are very far apart. This results in a nice and smooth curve. So that means that when you're working with a cylindrical object, you can keep your poly count pretty low. And then you just have to adjust your subdivision amount accordingly. Speaking of the subdivision amount, you can simply adjust it by clicking the subdivision object, and you will have the subdivision amount here. You will have two options for the editor and the renderer. So the first amount here is the amount of subdivision you will see while working in your viewport, and the second amount is the amount of subdivision you will see in your final render. Now there's different types of subdivision. Each of them has a specific use case, but I would personally recommend staying with the default one, this one, because it's the most common and versatile one. So now that we saw how subdivision affects primitive objects, let's see how it affects a practical product model. So here we have a very nice headphones model, and let's see how the subdivision affects its general shape and details. I'm gonna zoom in pretty close on some key details and show you how it affects them. Here we have some small ventilation holes on the model, and you will see that when I toggle the subdivision, every little detail becomes much smoother. This not only applies for small details like these holes, but it also applies for bigger surfaces like these ear pads. As you can see, they go from very low poly to a super high dense mesh and a very smooth surface. Same thing goes for this logo here. As you can see, it becomes nice and smooth. Here, as you can see, we have a very small detail. It's the charging port, and you can see how it affects its shape. Everything becomes really smooth. Alright, so that was the subdivision workflow. We saw how it works as well as how it can affect shapes. Now let's jump into the next episode where we'll take a look at the most common topology problems that occur during the subdivision modeling workflow.